Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper, and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. Today I am coloring this art impression stamp set. I am not sure what it's called. It doesn't have a title anywhere on it. I'm going to color both the grandpa and the grandma and add a little bit of a scene behind it. I'm going to change out her slippers for boots, so we're going to do a little bit of masking. I will be coloring with Copic markers on a piece of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I did make a couple of boo-boos with my masking that I then had to fix. I also did a little bit of lazy masking. So my color combinations will be listed in the blog, the accompanying blog, which actually I think isn't scheduled to go live until Tuesday because life. So, what else about the card? I can't think of anything else about the coloring. Sometimes I'm a little bit off screen. I apologize. Not for very much and nothing that you hadn't seen me color before. So now that we're done talking about the coloring, let's go ahead and talk about the crime. Our journey today takes us to the state of South Dakota. Now, South Dakota was part of the Dakota Territory, and the Dakota Territory was part of the Louisiana Purchase made by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. The division of North and South Dakota were more political than practical, and eventually South Dakota did become a state on November 2nd, 1889, at the same time as North Dakota did. They were signed into the Union as the 39th and 40th states, and President Benjamin Harrison shuffled the papers so nobody knows which state actually was signed into the Union first. Now, South Dakota hosts a large motorcycle rally. South Dakota has more shoreline than Florida, which is odd, but there's more landmass too, so okay. There are more than 1,300 bison that roam free in Custer State Park. South Dakota is home of the highest summit east of the Rockies. It is one of the longest and most complicated cave systems on the planet. And it is the location of one of the largest and most complete Tyrannosaurus Rex skeletons. South Dakota was at one point in time covered by the ocean. And today, all of that is really cool, but today we're going to talk about the state's first execution, its first hanging, and the fallout that came from this event. Strangely enough, though, our true crime story today begins not in South Dakota, but in Ireland. Between 1845 and 1852, there was a nationwide potato famine in Ireland. After the inclusion of Ireland into the UK, politics ran amok. There was political and religious contention between the Catholics and the Protestants, and between the UK's parliament and Ireland's own parliament. The changing political and religious climates didn't cause the potato famine, but they greatly contributed to the lack of ability to prepare and then survive the famine. The potato famine was caused by a blight that ran through the potato fields and that caused the potato plants to rot in the ground. Potatoes were the main source of food for the Irish, especially the tenant farmers and the poor, because they're cheap and they can be made 1,000 ways. As people ran out of food to eat and as the farm owners ran out of food to share, people began to leave these tenant farms, and they went to families to live with families in the less devastated parts of Ireland and the UK, and that was the beginning of a mass exodus to the United States of the Irish people. Now, one of those families that immigrated to the United States were the Lyons. Technically they immigrated and I'm trying to remember now. We're going to talk about Mary and Michael Lyons. Okay, Mary was born in Ireland to Elizabeth and Edward Elston, and she was 15 when she married Michael. And we're not even going to talk about her being 15, except to say it was kind of sort of normal then, especially in poorer families. I don't have a lot of information on Michael, except that he was born in 1837 sometime, and he married Mary in 1856. So he would have been about 19 to her 15. Still kind of creepy, but okay. Before the birth of their first child, who actually died shortly after his birth in 1859, Michael and Mary had immigrated to the United States. So they came to the U.S. as a married couple. And it was not during the worst of the famine years that they came, but Ireland was still in staggering poverty. So Mary and Michael moved to the U.S. and they ended up in Wisconsin. They had, again, their son who died at birth, and then a daughter named Catherine, who was actually born on Christmas Day in December of 1861. The only other thing I could find about Mary and Michael was that by 1866, Michael had died, leaving Mary a widow with a 5-ish-year-old daughter. Thomas Egan was born in 1835, also in Ireland, to Daniel and Margaret Egan. Now, when Thomas was about 20, he immigrated to the United States. But he came via Philadelphia instead of New York. And I don't know if that changed the course of events or not. Because instead of joining the military with the approaching Civil War, he actually was able to avoid that fate. Now, I don't know if that was choice, luck, or because he came in through Philadelphia instead of New York. I don't know how that happened, but he left Pennsylvania and traveled to Wisconsin, where he met, you guessed it, the widowed Mary Lyons. He and Mary were married on November 14th of 1866. And for the first 10 years of their marriage, they lived in Wisconsin. Now, I did not find any record of how they made their living, but I'm guessing farming. So, I mean, that just based on what happens next, I'm guessing farming. So, in the 1870 time frame, the Dakota territories were having a lot of homestead families coming in. And in 1876, Mary and Thomas also moved west and settled in the Dakota Territory in what would become South Dakota. Now, by the time they moved from Wisconsin to South Dakota, the family had grown, and Mary had given birth to 3 sons, Sylvester, John, and Thomas Jr. Now, this is kind of where things start to go weird. And I say start to because they go weird the whole rest of the story. When Mary and Thomas moved, they left 5-year-old Catherine. No, sorry, she would not have been 5. She would have been 15. 15-year-old Catherine in Wisconsin with some extended family. The idea was that she would join them once they got to South Dakota and had their homestead and their house up and running. It was 3 years before Catherine actually joined them in South Dakota, and shortly after arriving, the then 18-year-old Catherine married a neighbor named James Van Horn. The next odd thing here is that Thomas didn't like James, and apparently that was a two-way street, but Thomas didn't stop Catherine from marrying him. They just didn't get along. So this was the beginning of the Dakota boom. This is when mining and gold panning and all of the things that made the Dakota territories really expand. This was kind of the hotbed of that time. And the next few years were plentiful for the Egan family. Their homestead was a success. They had all the things that they needed. But things at home weren't good. Thomas had developed a reputation, not a good reputation. He was reportedly hostile and angry to most people, including his wife. When he drank, which he did often, he was abusive, not just to his wife. He had altercations with neighbors as well. And by the fall of 1880, the town rumor mill was running rampant with the information that Mary and Thomas had, in fact, gone through legal routes to begin a divorce. So the Egans were headed for divorce. In addition to being embroiled in a marital dispute with his wife, Thomas was also in a quarrel with his stepdaughter Catherine and her son John over a tree. I don't know what the quarrel was about. I don't know if it was their tree fell on his land. He wanted to cut down the tree to use it to build something. I don't know what the quarrel was, but they were in a mad fight about a tree. Now, contrary to Thomas, Mary had a different reputation in town. She was loved by her children. She was loved by her neighbors. She worked alongside of and sometimes without her husband to improve the family homestead. She did back-breaking labor, and that was harder when Thomas was violent toward her. She was reportedly a soft-spoken woman, and her neighbors didn't really have a bad thing to say about her, except maybe to wonder how she ever got mixed up with Thomas and how come she hadn't ended that yet. Now, we know why, because it was the 1870s, 1880s, and women couldn't even own property still in most of the states and territories. That's how come she didn't get out. But anyways, details of the next few days are sketchy, but what unfolded was tragic. And I promise you that if these events weren't recorded, you would swear it was fiction. You would swear it was fiction. On Sunday, April 12th, 1880, after breakfast had been eaten, Thomas sent his sons away from the farm with instructions to stay away until Tuesday or until he came for them. Now, based on the information you find out later, I guess that was not unusual. But in my mind, it's unusual. There is a newspaper article on Mary's find-a-grave that indicates that they were working with a neighbor or neighbors to fell and split trees, probably for firewood, maybe for construction of buildings. It was the fall, so I'm guessing firewood. So later, the same Sunday, after Thomas sent his boys to wherever they were supposed to be working, he joined them, and they worked on gathering wood. Now, Thomas and his children his boys returned home on Tuesday, and things were a little bit odd. So here's some more weird in this whole story. There's a buggy parked outside the house. It didn't say that there was a horse attached, but there was a buggy parked outside the house. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. And when they walked into the house, the house was in a state of disarray. In fact, the Sunday breakfast dishes were still in the kitchen. There had been the kitchen had not been cleaned. There was obvious signs of a struggle. There was blood on the floor by a trap door to the cellar, and Mary was not in the home. She was not in the kitchen. She was not at the buggy. She was not in the home. So a search was conducted, and Thomas and his youngest son, Tommy, and a neighbor named John Ryan investigated the cellar and found Mary in the cellar, dead. Catherine and her husband were told about Mary's death, and then the neighbors and the townfolk were informed of Mary's death. And like all murderers, because it was obvious that that's what this was, there was nothing suggesting that Mary had put herself in the cellar and then died. It was clearly from the scene a murder. The first suspect is always the spouse, the partner, the significant other, the recently broken up with, all those people. And Thomas was first on the list. The rumors of divorce and his reputation for being angry and nasty and mean, he was first on the list. The neighbors got together and they talked about what they knew about his behavior toward Mary and toward others. They talked about knowing of this impending divorce, and they talked about the scene at the home. And coming as a surprise to no one, Thomas was arrested for the murder of his wife, Mary. Here's another weird. His arrest was a citizen's arrest. He was not arrested by a sheriff. He was actually placed, tied up, and restrained by John Van Horn, his son-in-law, Frank Vandermark, and Elton Warren. They restrained him. They tied him up. They put him in a wagon at gunpoint and drove him to Sioux Falls and turned him over to the Sheriff Joe Dixon. All the while, Thomas is claiming his innocence. Now, Thomas sat in jail in Sioux Falls for 14 months. That's 14 months. He was not visited by his children. He was not visited by his neighbors. There were reports of priests often seen at the jail, attempting to convince him to confess and repent. He didn't. He steadfastly declared his innocence. The next weird is that Sheriff Dickinson and Thomas became friends. Yeah, they became friends. So the trial of Thomas Egan for the murder of Mary Egan began in November of 1881, so a year after her death, and it was conducted in the court in Sioux Falls. The prosecutor was John W. Carter, and Thomas was represented by two prominent attorneys, C.H. Windsor and L.S. Sweeney. There was also supposed to be some other attorneys that were helping in his defense, but one of those attorneys was selected to be the representative at the state congressional level, so that didn't pan out. The man who presided over Thomas's trial was Jefferson P. Kidder. He was one of the three justices on the Territorial Supreme Court, and he was the trial judge under the federal court system. So Judge Kidder was actually a very popular Dakotan. He served 2 terms as a territorial delegate to Congress. He was known for being intelligent, fair-minded, and capable. And he had a reputation of being merciful when it came to sentencing people who were convicted by a jury. So Thomas is not what was considered a high-profile defendant. Like, he wasn't famous, popular, or wealthy or anything. His crime was scandalous, but he himself was an unknown. But his trial drew crowds, big crowds, from all the parts of the Dakota Territory, and from Iowa and Nebraska. That was very typical at the time, actually. This is a time period where, like, by November, your farming is done for the winter, and leisure activities are few and far between, especially when it gets dark at 6.5 minutes past noon in the middle of the winter. So it was normal for people to come to the courthouse and hear the trial, or listen to the trial. And people went in for the gossip, for the salacious testimonies, for the graphic details. And in this case, they were not disappointed. From the outset, the prosecution was in control. They described in detail the injuries Mary received, supposedly at Thomas's hand, or allegedly at Thomas's hand. We have to say that, right? The argument on the prosecution side was that Thomas approached Mary as she was cleaning up the kitchen on that Sunday, that he threw a rope around her neck and began to strangle her. And while she was incapacitated, he beat her to death with a club until he was sure she was dead. And after that, threw her in the basement through a trapdoor in the floor, the cellar, through a trapdoor in the floor. So yeah, they were not disappointed. In addition, another weird, the Thomas's 3 sons were allowed to testify. They lied about their ages, and the youngest boy, Tommy, was only 6. There was testimony from the boys that Thomas frequently hit Mary, called her names, knocked her down. There was a testimony from witnesses that Thomas had talked about his intent to trade Mary in for a younger woman. William Van Horn, which I assume must be related to John, the son-in-law, actually produced a hardwood picket that he claimed he found near the Egan house. Now, a pin picket is the piece of wood that would be pounded into the ground to tie horses and wagons to. But he had it in his own possession for 16 months without ever turning it over to authorities. and it was admitted into evidence as the probable murder weapon. See what I'm talking about? Weird on top of weird on top of weird. And it just gets weirder. So the defense team, missing their ringer, the guy who got called into the state Congress, they were... The one comment that was made about them was that they lacked professionalism, passion, and had no valid argument of Thomas's innocence. Okay, they were outlawyered. They failed to pursue, or they failed to cross-examine witnesses. They didn't dispute evidence. And the other thing that was a big factor was that Thomas was a Irish Catholic. Now, at this time, Irish Catholics were not loved. In fact, they were hated almost as much as African Americans in the South. They were called terrible names. They were treated horribly. They were denied employment, except for the most basic jobs. Their homes and their churches were destroyed purely out of political prejudice. And often, in order for politicians to gain favor with the non-Irish Catholics. So simply being Irish Catholic became a liability for Thomas. So like I said, weird on weird on weird. Now, after hearing all of the testimony, the jury was given instructions by Judge Kidder. And after a short deliberation, and I don't know how long, but I think the same day, short deliberation, he was found guilty as charged, even though there was no direct evidence linking him to the death of his wife. Sorry, words are hard. So the sentence that was handed down by Judge Kidder was the sentence of death. I mean, this is the 1880s, and when you kill somebody, you were sentenced to death. That's just how things rolled in the day, right? His hanging was scheduled to take place on January 13th of 1882. Now, while in the courtroom, when Thomas heard, or when Judge Kidder set the death sentence and the execution date, Thomas said, fine. He accepted that was his fate, but in court, on the record, he condemned his stepdaughter Catherine and her husband John, saying that they betrayed him and warned them that the curse of God was upon them. He is still claiming innocence. He is madder than a hornet's nest. None of his kids have visited him. I mean, the only friend he has left is the sheriff, right? So while trials were also your leisure activity in the day, public executions were also heavily attended by families, whole families. They stopped what they were doing. They made their way to the gallows. They made it a reunion, kind of like a community party. There were picnics and overnight stays in a hotel. Now it's January in South Dakota, so probably no picnicking going on. But this was the norm for public executions. And it was no different on Thomas's execution date. The idea being that if youngsters see what happens when you commit crimes, they will be less likely to commit the crime. I'm not sure I disagree with that, but I don't know if I would take my 3-year-old to a public execution. I'm just saying. So, weird on weird on weird. January 13th, 1882, Thomas was taken to the gallows and read, they read the whole, I can't think of the word, the judge's death, the sentence, they read the whole sentence. He's taken to the gallows. He had his hands tied. A rope was placed around his neck. The trap door was sprung. Thomas fell about 5 feet and the rope broke. And because Thomas had his hands tied, he landed on his face and chest. Okay. So Thomas was taken up again to the gallows. A second rope was found. Thomas was once again brought to the trap door, and this time the rope was too long. And there was a question as to whether or not the hanging had been complete. So 4 men carried the less than fully conscious Thomas back to the gallows. A rope was placed around him again, and this time the rope/gallows combination was successful, and Thomas was declared dead at 9:46 a.m. The community who witnessed the execution was satisfied that Mary's murderer had been found, tried, and executed for his crime. And South Dakota's first execution was undoubtedly a failure from the swift and clean perspective. Okay, I mean, they got it done, but what a technical nightmare that execution was. Technical nightmare. I mean, they successfully captured the criminal. They held him for trial. He had what was considered an appropriate trial, even though his defense was less than awesome. The judge was as merciful as he could be. His sentence was handed down, but the technical end of his execution was a hot mess. Just a hot mess. And just because this story, this case, has been full of weirdness, let's just keep adding it on, okay? So at some point after the death of her mother and the execution of her stepfather, Catherine and her husband moved, and they ended up in Seattle, Washington. Okay, that's a hike, South Dakota to Seattle, Washington. Clearly they're not farming still, so I'm not sure what they're, but anyway. On June 3rd, 1927, at the age of 65, and on her deathbed, Catherine spoke about her mother's murder. In fact, she confessed that she was the one who had actually killed her mother. Her family physician was in the room with her as she confessed, and at her insistence, wrote down her confession word for word. She said, in part, quote, "Back in South Dakota in the early 80s, I killed my mother. We quarreled, and I hit her again and again over the head until she died. No one ever suspected me. My stepfather, Thomas Egan, was hung for the crime. He died vowing his innocence." Okay, pick your jaws up off the floor because you didn't see that one coming, did you? There is a historical marker in downtown Minnehaha County in Sioux Falls in South Dakota talking about the fact that the first execution committed in South Dakota was the execution of a man who turned out to be innocent. Okay, I want to talk about, as many things as I can get in this video. First of all, why was Catherine, the oldest child, left with family members when the family moved to South Dakota? Was that because her stepfather did not want her? Or was that because she didn't want to move because she was 15 and teenagers or extra? I did not find anything that indicated she did not have a good relationship with her younger brothers. There would have been like a 7-year age gap between her and the oldest of her 3 younger brothers. But there was nothing in the reports that said there was any love lost there. One of the sources that I read did describe her as being mischievous, but have you ever met a 15-year-old? They are. They just are. And it didn't sound like she was any worse than any other 15-year-old. She got married when she was 18. I mean, that's still young for today's standards, but, older than her mom by 3 years. But here's the other thing that's resting on my mind. So William brings to trial, 16 months after the death of Mary, the picket pin that was admitted into evidence as the probable murder weapon, and he is related to Catherine's husband. Either a brother or a father. I did not chase down that link because I forgot. And it's Monday night, not Monday morning, and I was running late getting this up and going. So I forgot to chase down that link. But she said in her confession that nobody knew she did it. But somebody she was related to had the murder weapon for over a year while Thomas sat in jail and told everybody who would listen that he had not done it. All right, I want to hear your thoughts. I want you to get into the comment and tell me what you think about this. First of all, no real good pictures. We have a picture of Mary's headstone. We have a sketch of what people said Thomas looked like based on a trial. We have a picture of the historical marker and a picture of Thomas's headstone. Tell me what you think. Thanks for hanging out with me. I have a couple other videos here I think you would like. I also have that subscribe button. Like I said, leave me a comment down below. I want to hear what you think about this story. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up, and I hope you have a really fabulous day.